Nau mai, hoki mai ki Otherfold, e mihi nei, ko Duncan Greive tōku ingoa. Welcome back, Glenn.
Welcome, Duncan. Feels like it's been a while since we talked.
Yeah, it does. It's been a weird period in media in that they don't feel like in the past 3 to 4 weeks there's been a cataclysmic failure or change.
I think everything got put right in the world on Saturday evening, Duncan, when the Crusaders claimed victory again. The world returned to its normal state, as it should be, with the Crusaders in charge. And I'm watching Te Ahi at the moment cringe.
Yeah, that does unfortunately feel like something that is very much a. I mean, it's hardly like, given the weekend we just had, that indicates that the world is back to normal, because it was about 12 hours from there till the bunker busters dropped. But by New Zealand media standards, undeniably a sort of a more peaceable period. So we're just going to kind of hit a few things that have kind of come up in recent times. Probably the biggest chunk of the episode will be on TVNZ. Jodie O'Donnell gave an interview to Shane, which kind of outlined a few different things. And I've sort of had conversations with some execs there as well, so I can kind of bring some of that knowledge to bear. We'll also talk a bit about the structural separation of WBDs. You'll know the precise language they've used in terms of these two companies that have been created.
Yeah, global networks and studios and streaming.
That's right. And then finally, we'll do a little quick hit on the Nielsen digital numbers, which have shown what was once a very close kind of swapping back and forth race between the Herald and Stuff to be looking almost decided now. Stuff with a very, very substantial lead in that regard. We'll hit on all of that. But let's start with TVNZ. So Shane's done very well with his new podcast, where he's basically, I think his first was with Goldsmith, Stephen Joyce came not long after, Jodie O'Donnell after that. So he's basically getting the kind of big newsmakers within media, and they're not long, but there's a real there are news lines that come out of these things every time. They feel kind of well prepped, well brokered in that regard. The most interesting thing, I don't think we've discussed this out of the Stephen Joyce episode, incidentally, was him basically suggesting towards the end, and I didn't see a lot of pickup on this, but it echoed actually what David Parker had said on an episode of Gone by Lunchtime earlier in the year, that if you're looking for he was basically saying, I don't think that the Fair Digital News bargaining bill is going to hunt. That's something we've canvassed pretty well, but he did sort of float the idea of why not extend the same kind of obligations that currently sit on the likes of TVNZ, the Herald, or the spin-off for that matter, onto social media, particularly around defamation and that kind of thing. So, which, for someone like Stephen Joyce, pretty interesting position.
Yeah, so is it Section 22?
230 in the US. We've got a different thing, but has essentially the same meaning.
Harmful communication.
Correct.
Effectively, yeah. It does seem like it's a legitimate pathway that could avoid, the tariff geopolitical or the Trump geopolitical response. Because there is no adversity against them as individual companies being treated exactly the same way as other companies are. So it does seem like a legitimate pathway, but I haven't heard anything coming out of government that's something that they're actually actively looking at.
I mean, the thing is, it's both simple, elegant, fair, and nuclear.
Yeah.
In the sense that it's not at all clear to me that the social companies in particular, the sort of Meta, Instagram, TikTok. I think YouTube probably could still operate, but I'm not sure that their business models, as they currently stand, would function without the protection of that kind of legislation. And so there's no suggestion that it is on the agenda, but just to have someone with Stephen Joyce's reputation within and relationship to still an active member of National saying it is interesting, let's put it that way. But the most recent episode was an interview with Jodie O'Donnell, who I caught up with recently, and she basically, I think, we're now, I think, a bit over 18 months into her time leading TVNZ. There's been, she's probably 2/3 the way through, like an exec, not clear out, but just, the kind of thing that any new leader wants to come in and refresh that kind of part of the company. They had obviously a very torrid first year, but there were just a few kind of beats to that story, that came out of that interview, which I think are worth dwelling on. The first being, or the most interesting to me being that there's been this discussion about TVNZ and having a sort of paywall of some description. And, you and I have both talked about the cost associated with that, because content becomes more expensive and you need really premium stuff to sit behind the paywall. You can't just remove ads from what you already have. And what's come out of the interview, which is, I think, quite an interesting approach, is that rather than create a new subscription service, and I think a lot of people would like to have less subscription services than they currently do and don't love the idea of adding one, is that actually, with sports, they're looking at a pay-per-view strategy. So you buy a match, or maybe you buy a pass to watch a sort of a tournament or something, rather than having an always-on subscription. They're looking at bidding for the Olympics with that as a kind of as part of the strategy. And I don't know, what do you make of that?
I thought it was really good, really clever, and a really good way to introduce diversity of revenue into their business model. It minimises the risk to some degree of going all out at a paywall, as you've talked about, the cost of content, the volume of content that's required to come through, and the risk that sits around the revenue returns, was always a question mark for me in the current TVNZ model. But to have a model that is still ostensibly free, where they can bid, still big sums of money, but a marquee event like the Olympics, I mean, I would pay for an Olympic pass to be able to access everything that was available during that for a 2-week period. And you've seen like some of the revenues that get generated out of these passes. Like I remember when Spark Sport won the Rugby World Cup many years ago, and there was the pass that they made available. Now, Spark Sport ultimately failed, but actually the revenue they made out of that one-off event was pretty extraordinary. And so for TVNZ to be able to replicate that, I think is a really, really interesting and good thing.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there's something about the Olympics as an event specifically, which doesn't necessarily sit super well within an always-on subscription environment. You get, it's all concentrated and done and dusted in 3 weeks. So, while you might get a flood of people onto a Sky Sports Now for the period of the tournament, whether they stick around if they're largely fans of the event itself is far less clear. But if you're monetizing it over, maybe you get you're going to have an Olympics channel that's probably free, that's your sort of key events and highlights, but you could buy all of hockey, say, or all of eventing. I think there's probably a lot of different ways that you can cut that. And if you think about what the Olympics is, it's this bundle of a lot of different events, and there's a mixture of people who are diehards for that particular sport, or they find it fascinating once every 4 years. But if you kind of cut it up into different packages and pieces, you can actually see that the total monetizable audience and what people feel like represents value for money for them in that period could be a lot larger than has been realized by the current ways of taking it to market to this point.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think part of the secret sauce to a TVNZ bid is the fact that they can offer free-to-air exposure, as you point out, on an always-on channel or of some form, running dedicated news programming around the Olympics. That's really valuable to a rights holder like the Olympics to obviously raise the profile of all sports during the Olympics. If you go back to previous Olympics, we saw Sky partner with TVNZ for that exact reason, to be able to get more exposure to the sport. So the battleground's very much been drawn now, though, hasn't it? Because TVNZ are saying, well, actually, no, we don't need a partner with you. We've got all of the assets ourselves and an ability to go direct. Sky have been using Sky Open more and more to be able to create that exposure for events. And so, any bid has the potential to be inflationary in terms of the rights costs. The tricky thing is, or maybe not, but Sky certainly have years of history of bidding and winning and securing those rights and knowing what's in play in those rights. And the strategic game then happens around bidding each other up potentially, or bidding people to a point where it becomes or less economic than what it could be. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that all plays out.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, the second piece which has been reported is that the NZ Rugby's deal with Sky is as yet unannounced. Gregor Paul and certainly, I'm sure, sources I've spoken to as well say that the Sky portion of it is done, and what is holding it up is, and what has been reported, is that they're trying to find a home for some free-to-air rugby outside of the Sky distribution channels, and that TVNZ and potentially 3 are part of the mix for that, likely with NPC, like a few NPC games, and what they're quibbling over is potentially the cost of those rights. Is that's your understanding too?
Yeah, I think on one hand, New Zealand Rugby need to be able to maximise the value of the rights they hold, and so there's a monetary impact there. On the other hand, there is what is the audience that most suits rugby and is most different from what they currently have today. And so that's the obvious TVNZ3 debate. 3 probably have an audience that is attractive. TVNZ probably have deeper pockets in terms of how they would go after this. But look, either way, I think free-to-air exposure for NPC is going to be really, really good for the game, and really important for New Zealand Rugby to get more eyeballs looked on, looking at our local teams. We're all familiar with what happens with Super Rugby, on a Friday and Saturday night, but to see these other games played, and hopefully may also be able to increase the attendance at some of these games by having that free-to-air exposure. Yeah,
you sort of think with the NPC, it's become this, to a certain extent, an orphan tournament in terms of the amount of emphasis that gets placed on it. It feels like a distant third after international and Super Rugby in this part of the world. But I think if you had it back on free-to-air in the afternoons, and maybe you did something different in terms of the kind of presentation of it, which, if you've got a different broadcast partner, you have the ability to do that. And I think there is for a lot of New Zealanders, they grew up with a particular relationship with NPC, and I think you could kind of trade off that sort of nostalgic component it has, and I think that it's sort of hard to do that within the current system.
Well, I remember, deep history with, obviously growing up in Canterbury. I still remember the NPC game between Canterbury and Auckland in the mid-'80s. It was an absolute one for the ages. And then, early days in radio, we used to have a relationship supporting Canterbury Rugby at halftime with events and things, and you'd go to Rugby Park on a Saturday afternoon. The crowd, it was a full crowd there watching the game. There were activities outside. There were barbecues going, and it was a great event. And I think bringing people back into the game, back into that event, and building love for the game is, an incredibly important opportunity. And hopefully, it's something that we see come to life.
I think if you look at the kind of the way that all the various parties to this interact and where they're at, sort of Sky is in this situation where until that deal is sort of signed, it can't quite, and it's public, a lot of its things are effectively paused because it's so momentous for the company.
Yeah, well, they've signed up. Sky has done the deal. Obviously, we've talked about this lots with Max to have, that entertainment pipeline locked up. and it's signed up a lot of the marquee sports that it needs.
It's got cricket back.
Cricket back.
Yeah.
So there's the one missing, right, which is rugby, that it just needs to close
And then
out.
it just knows what it looks like at least through the end of the decade, which is longer than most people in media can see.
Yep.
The hard part on some level is that rugby over the last 6 months or 12 months has seen the head of commercial resign, seen its overall CEO, Mark Robinson, resign, and seen David Kirk come in as the new chair. Chair's always been a very powerful figure within rugby. So you're sort of looking at a situation where they've got a bit of a leadership vacuum at the top, or at least on the inside of the business. You're still betting in Silver Lake's investment, and you've got a very new chair as you're committing to a fairly long-term deal here. So it's all kind of fairly delicately poised as a result. But I think for both rugby and for TVNZ, if they can get in there, albeit NPC is not what it was 30 years ago in terms of public interest, their argument, for 3 or TVNZ would be, well, we can. That's in part because it's been behind a paywall and been, like if it were to go to either of those places, that's their premium rugby product because they don't have any others.
Yeah.
So it is just treated differently in those environments.
I mean, I could only speculate here of what they might do, but could they create an NPC pass, for a weekend or for the whole tournament again, using their paywall strategy, but still have a free-to-air game on a Saturday afternoon on One, for example. Seems a very credible thing that they could do and should do, and would be great for the game. Yeah,
absolutely. And all of this is contingent. Like, this is not technology that TVNZ has to hand right now, but their new platform is coming, likely next year, and like the CRL, the convention centre, it's been talked about for a long time, but it will kind of unlock their ability to sort of change the business in a digital context in a way that hasn't been possible up until now.
Yeah, the tricky thing, obviously, when they go through a replatform to enable all of this, is the other considerations. You've got to start taking people's credit cards. You've got to start processing transactions. Your call centre starts to look different. So the business of TVNZ needs to transform quite a bit to enable all of that. So it'll be interesting to watch that happen.
Absolutely. So sticking with TVNZ, if sports and pay-per-view represent the future, the history of TVNZ, particularly TVNZ2, has been Shortland St as this juggernaut show that kind of propped up the whole channel in the way that news does for TVNZ1. This time last year, it was in a sort of an existential crisis. There was a sort of a multi-pronged solution found where it went back to 3 days, which reduced the costs associated with it, and it was made eligible for the Spur, and New Zealand On Air came to the party with funding for the first time since the mid-90s. So you wrap all those things up, and the cost associated with it for TVNZ probably went backwards by 2/3, even as the output only declined by 2/5. There were problems which are only starting to become clear now that are associated with that, chiefly that because of they didn't change the pace that they shot, they just shot it, for a shorter period of the year. So I think in the next month or so, if it hasn't already happened, they're going to finish shooting, which means that it means a few different things. One is Shortland St always had this kind of almost uncanny ability to feel connected to the culture and news and world events, and sort of sometimes shoot things kind of late, like, it felt connected to the zeitgeist in a way which just becomes a lot harder if you're done by, halfway through the year, but you play out until much later in the year. But the bigger problem that's being kind of discussed now is the fact that the cast, who were previously effectively employees, are now contractors and therefore are off contract and have the ability, also probably the financial need to go and get other work, which might not mean that they're available to shoot again next year, were that to happen. So, for a soap which relies on continuity of characters and storylines, that's a bigger problem than we saw, right?
Yeah, I feel for SPP and the cast and crew, because effectively what you're dealing with is there's zero certainty sitting on the future of how that show, at the moment at least, will come together. It feels like it's inevitable at some point the lolly scramble of funding will come to an end. TVNZ, I don't believe, have made any firm commitments yet at this point, and so that SPP are kind of left with no other option than to move everyone into that kind of contractor role to give themselves the optionality into the future, which is devastating for those involved. And in fact, hard for everyone, right? I imagine hard for TVNZ, hard for the cast and crew, hard for SPP, but this
hard
is
for New Zealand On Air. The whole thing is a really difficult situation because, and if it's not still the case, it was until very recently that Shortland St was the most watched show on TVNZ Plus as well as on TVNZ2. So it's a very important platform. It's also really expensive, and and it's suffering audience decline because it was a young-facing show. It's probably just going down in lockstep with the decline in audience, younger audiences everywhere, but still. The challenge is the challenge, and as of right now, if you're part of that cast and crew, or if you are, South Pacific Pictures, the production company, you're in this bind where you can't commit out into the future, and so that feels like it's going to be forced to a conclusion very quickly. Now, obviously, they'll be back speaking to New Zealand On Air. Have heard no good read on whether they would go again. It's a pretty substantial piece of funding for them, and that and if it were to go, yes, it saves TVNZ some money, but how TVNZ Plus is the future of the company. TVNZ2's, I don't know, it would be a pretty big shock to that second channel if it were to go.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that Jodie talked about is she signalled a return to profitability, obviously, for TVNZ, and it'll be interesting to look under the hood of that once the results are out around the driver of it. No doubt TVNZ Plus continues to grow, but I suspect a big driver of that has been the linear performance of 1 and 2 and Duke. And so, as you're making the transition to a digital business, you want to, make that legacy business work as hard as possible, generate as much cash flow as possible and profit as possible to make to enable the future. And so, Shortland St with that lens on it looks like a good bet to continue to make for as long as possible. But I do suspect that they will be reliant on New Zealand On Air coming to the party again, and that's a big unknown.
Yeah, I mean the thing that's in its favour is that it's such a big, popular, beloved show that it has a political dimension. If you remember a few years ago when Concert FM was, there was talk from, NZ effectively announced that they were going to take it off FM and replace it with a youth network, and this sort of sleeping monster of support came up and squashed that really quickly. And Shortland St probably won't get Helen Clark out of bed and complaining, but there'll be enough of a hardcore of support that it will be kind of weighed by the current government that, do we want, even if it's only, say, 180,000 angry people now, that's not a significant proportion of the electorate if they were made really mad. And so in some ways it's fortunate that it has that lever that's always sort of sitting there in the background to an extent. But as you said, back to profitability after a pretty torrid year, and also just the general media sector being one that's incredibly challenged. And I think for Jodie in her first full year as chief executive to be able to point at that, how it was done, really hard. There's still a lot of hurt feelings around Sunday and Fair Go and other sort of cuts in and out of news there, and this is a significantly smaller company than the one she took over, but to stabilise and to achieve that result in this really challenging market is really impressive, I think.
It is. It's very, very, very good. I'm really interested to see, as I said, the drivers that sit behind that. Clearly a lot of work on the cost base. We've read about that a lot in the last 12 months. But I'm keen to understand I suspect they are holding revenue up a lot better in relation to the overall linear audience decline that's happening. And it'll be interesting to see just how effective that is for them. I suspect it's very effective based on the result. And interested to see also just the growth rate of TVNZ Plus, because they talked about the need to triple their digital revenues over that kind of 5-year strategy, and just see where are they, on that path towards doing that. The one thing I do note, and I watch TVNZ Plus a lot, is there's just more and more innovation coming into the way they serve ads and build commercial partners into that product. The work they did with Pack and Save just recently was very clever, and so really good to see that happening. But really keen to see what are the drivers that are creating that profitability.
So that will be in the next sort of month or two. I think they have a June 30 end of financial year. So, and finally, let's talk a bit about the Nielsen results. I mean, it's really the headline figure that is the one it's not a surprise. It's only an increase of 13,000 in terms of the sort of scale of the result, but. So Stuff put out a press release on June 19 saying that Stuff's got 2.382 million New Zealanders visiting it on a monthly basis, which is 574,000 Kiwis ahead of its nearest competitor, unnamed, but obviously the Herald. That's a pretty, that's sort of like, thick end of 20% up on or more on the Herald, which was once like a line ball race with them both around 2 million. Pretty serious thing to be able to extend and bake in a lead of that scale.
Yeah, I could often never figure out who was number one, because it seemed like you read the press releases, it felt like both were number one at the same time. But these numbers are pretty clear, and that's a big gap. Have you got any insight into what you think the driver of that gap is in recent time? Like, what's changed?
Well, the thing that's, I guess, become sort of more like Stuff did a re-platform, I don't know, probably a couple of years ago now, and the Herald has obviously had a paywall for 5 years now, and news consumption is very habitual. And I think that, and this is pure conjecture, this is not based on any inside information, but it just takes a long time for people to sort of understand what, especially people who are maybe more casual news consumers, and that's what the sort of tail of this audience that is likely moved across. What is what is fundamental to the product, and so I think the fact of having a paywall baked into the product, where Stuff has a paywall strategy, but it's sort of at a certain remove, and I think they've done quite an impressive thing in terms of the way that they leverage scoops from their portfolio of mastheads into the Stuff platform, and even the fact that they leave the paywalls open far more frequently on the mastheads publications. I think as a news consumer, you sort of start to rely on that and know that most of what you get served at Stuff is accessible to you, irrespective of whether you're logged in or a subscriber. Whereas at the Herald, you go to the homepage, and if you're not a logged in subscriber, you're probably 50-60% of the homepage isn't accessible to you. And even if you are a Herald subscriber, you've got Viva, you've got Listener, you've got Business Desk Stories, all of which take up space on that homepage, which are not available to you. That would be my sort of guess at the driver.
Do you think that there's because of what you've just laid out, there's an implied sense of increased trust, not trust of the editorial, but trust of the product, because I do get access to more, therefore it has greater utility for me?
That would be guesswork on my part, but I actually think just in general, I will venture this, that the fundamental Stuff product, because of the way it's served, because of the ad load on it, because it's had a more recent design refresh, it just feels kind of and less. Like the Herald homepage is busy right now. It's doing a lot of different things. I'd say from a revenue perspective, like if ads plus subscriptions, it wouldn't shock me if the Herald was, 1 or 2 times the revenue associated with Stuff Digital. Could well be wrong there. Again, no information out of the Stuff side on that front. But that's a category different question from how to, if you were doing an NPS score for satisfaction with the product. On the other, after a sort of an engagement experience, and I think that, they're almost playing 2 different games right now. So on some level, the scale of audience Nielsen number might be, it's always nice to be number 1, but it might be less material to NZME at the moment.
Yeah, it'll be, and I don't know the details of this either, but the power ratio, which is always one of the key metrics inside the organisation. So what's the relative revenue over the audience number? And as you point out, we would guess that Herald's probably doing a better job of that because of the having a longer time with the paywall. Interesting timing, though, for that announcement to come out, and no doubt lots of focus and conversation amongst the new NZME board and the leadership team.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably the most material part of it, right? That for Trade Me, the likely to be the new 50% owner of Stuff Digital, the fact that the audience is that far ahead is just a great place to start the relationship from.
Yep.
The one thing that's interesting to me, just going back to the way that it leverages masthead products, these were structurally separated, a conscious uncoupling at the start of last year, and Sinead in her interview, actually it's the Media Insider interview that I didn't mention, that it was at pains to say that both of the businesses are independently profitable. That might be true on a financial level. They don't feel like independent businesses at the moment because of the extent to which mastheads and digital interact through the Stuff platform. That doesn't mean that that's impossible or that they might really have cleaned up the accounting, but it feels like Stuff Digital has a considerable uplift in terms of the quality of its offering because of the way that mastheads relates to it. Right now, because Sinead's got full ownership and control of one and 50% or soon to be 50% once the transaction closes of the other, that's her business. But you do sort of wonder if over time, or if Trade Me were to take full control and they were to truly separate, whether that sort of relationship is sustainable on those terms. That's the only sort of little watch out from my perspective.
Yeah. Usually what would happen if that was the case, and again, this is all speculation, there will be some sort of transition agreement that exists for a period of years to ensure that they can maintain that until such time as both businesses can, run their own race on their own terms. That's a perfectly normal thing to happen. And all of this is happening, of course, and RNZ clearly the number 3 digital service now. It was interesting when NewsHub closed. We can look, 12 months on, and RNZ did a good job of picking up, a large chunk of that digital audience. But
they've done such a great job, I think, of establishing actually quite a differentiated brand in that space. Takes a long time to build the audience, especially when they can't sort of fire hose money on marketing or and that kind of thing, but yeah, really impressive job by Mark and Megan and
Stuff in the Herald won't be happy because they're drawing away commercial eyeballs away from their own platforms. But interesting for RNZ, they have had the reduction in funding obviously through the latest budget. We saw recently as a result of that the announcement of voluntary redundancies, which is always an interesting thing to do. But I feel a little for RNZ because they obviously didn't have a great radio survey result, but actually the other parts of their multi-platform strategy are absolutely working. But the question will be, they shouldn't necessarily work to the detriment of the radio product. So how does that radio product get back to relevance?
It's really interesting. Like I was just reading some results out of Australia, and that the ABC's share of radio audience in Sydney is less than 1%. So while RNZ is challenged there, if you actually look at it compared to a very close, much better funded competitor over the ditch, there's a similar struggle happening. And I sort of wonder if that sort of radio space, because they're a sort of a fairly singular proposition where the whole rest of the dial is doing something different, maybe that does make it a sort of a challenging thing to approach. That said, I do think that there's probably a level of dynamism about the radio product that isn't quite there at the moment.
Yeah, I feel that they, part of the problem is the brand. The name Radio New Zealand doesn't actually define what they do anymore.
I think they're technically called RNZ now, but yeah, it's look, it's a difficult thing to operate, especially where your budget's going backward and you're asking for voluntary redundancies. Just before we go, we should hit on the news out of WBD. Do you want to sort of take it away there and maybe give it us a bit of a sense of what the sort of current and future implications are for the local assets of that company?
Yeah, a couple of weeks ago now, David Zaslav, the CEO, had a meeting with the stock market and announced permanent structural separation of their global networks business, which is all the pay TV channels, free-to-air businesses around the world and in the US, from what's called the studios and streaming business. So Max is a streaming platform, Warner Brothers Studios, Warner Brothers television productions, and obviously all the movies that are produced into two separate businesses. That will likely take effect at some point mid-next year. Really interesting because both businesses will then, and both will be listed, both will attract different shareholders for different reasons. Studios and streaming business is a business that looks ripe for some form of consolidation, potentially with another studio or with the likes of Apple or Amazon, that type of partnership. Whereas the networks business will be run for very much cash. Most of the debt, when the company came together, will be sitting with the networks business, but that business is open to the likes of private equity, for example, coming in to do what they often do, get a return by maximising cash flow, pay down the debt, and make money that way. So really interesting that they have done that. I think it was the right thing to do. The company had struggled to actually bring those two things together and make an effective business model that was reflected in the share price. So this seems the right thing to do. There are immediate options for the networks business because Comcast, who owns NBC, have done something very similar, created a company called Versant where they've put all their networks in. So there's an opportunity for those two to potentially come together, particularly in the US. But it remains to be seen around how that will sort of trickle down to the world. Having been sitting locally leading the business, obviously while these types of transaction happens, the announcement is made and then it can take weeks, if not months, to actually truly understand what does it mean for individuals and the businesses here. So I imagine the team here in New Zealand will be very much business as usual. They'll be getting on with their day-to-day. But as it gets closer to the middle of next year, they will be thinking about how do we optimize our networks business, what does it need to look like, and what are the options for it.
Yeah, and there's been sort of conjecture about whether Three, which is obviously the big asset locally, whether the sort of natural future home of that might make more sense in Sky, which obviously has a free-to-air channel, but that channel doesn't have the prominence or the history that Three does. And if Sky were able to sort of take that on, it would give it. Well, it'd sort of be quite an asset to it, I think, given how much content they have and the different ways they could use it and open or just put all their emphasis into Three. That's a long way from being something that is more than something that people like me are conjecturing about, but it's the kind of thing that naturally is more open under the new structure of the businesses than it might previously have been.
I think there's a couple of things. One, it's in the DNA of WBD to buy and sell assets. It's what they do. They've done it for a long time. And so the first instinct, if that's something they look at, will be, what do we want to keep? What do we want to sell? Not suggesting in any way that Three is in that bucket, because at the moment, my understanding is the team are doing really well. The second thing, though, was Sky. Sky has a range of options ahead of it in terms of what it wants to do, and no doubt think about. And, if it did consider this would be one of many in the mix of things it's thinking about, from growth for the future. And that's going to be quite interesting to watch because, we've seen years of Sky doing a good job managing its cost base, ensuring that its shareholders get paid the dividend. And we've talked a little bit about this when we covered the results last time. There's a couple of challenges there in the business that they have to think about. One is streaming. What does that streaming business look like for them in the future? And how do they generate a growth narrative in the market? So I think there's a bit to watch there too.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will keep watching it. Great to be back with you, Glenn. And look forward to doing it again soon.
Sounds good. See you.